the Defense of Marriage Act. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this amendment in order to promote and ensure conformity and uniformity to the military culture, not the other way around, to promote religious liberty of military chaplains, and to promote consistency with federal laws on marriage. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington arise?
Madam Chair, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise in opposition to any amendment that seeks to delay the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Some of the majority continue to try to legislate this issue even though the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell was approved with overwhelming bipartisan support in December. As of last month, more than 1 million U.S. service members, roughly half of our armed forces, have been trained on the new law allowing gays and lesbians to serve openly in the military. Our military leaders, led by Admiral Mullen, have stated that they have seen no adverse impact on the force and that training is going very well. The current expectation is that all members of the active and reserve military force will be trained by mid-August. Last month, Secretary Gates indicated in an interview with the Associated Press that he sees no roadblocks to ending the ban on openly gay military service. Current Secretary Panetta said that he would work closely with the Joint Chiefs of Staff to assess whether the elements for certification in the law are met before approving the repeal. Our service members deserve the right to serve their country no matter their race, gender, or sexual orientation. Currently, gay and lesbian service members are forced to live under the constant threat of being forced out of the military because of the misguided Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I urge my colleagues to reject any amendment that seeks to delay implementation, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado rise?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This amendment strikes a very dangerous precedence for Congress to somehow micromanage the training processes of military chaplains. We have military chaplains from diverse faith backgrounds. We have many faiths, in fact, the majority of faiths that, for instance, don't sanctify gay marriage. We have other faiths. The one that I happen to belong to, I'm a member of the Reformed Jewish faith, and there's many other Christian faiths, including the Episcopalian faith, which do sanction same-sex unions. Likewise, it's an important part of chaplain training that they're allowed to counsel against, for instance, homosexual acts or extramarital heterosexual acts. That's a part of chaplaincy training as well. For Congress to interfere with the military processes of chaplaincy training is absurd and unprecedented. And with regard to this particular training program, I'd like to ask my friend from Kansas, Mr. Hulskamp, if I could just yield a moment to him if he has read this particular training manual that he's seeking to defund here, and I'll yield to the gentleman from Kansas.
Recognized.
Yes, if the gentleman will restate his question.
Would the gentleman from Colorado restate his
sorry. Has the gentleman from Kansas read the training manual that he's seeking to defund in this case?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. That's an excellent question. We tried to obtain a copy of that from the Department of Defense today, and they refused to provide a copy. What I do have is an online 3-page summary of the manual.
So reclaiming my time, I think that the straight answer is no, and in fact, our ranking member and others have been unable to get that from the Navy Liaison's office. Again, I think it's an offense to the military to second-guess their training for chaplains. No doubt those documents could eventually come our way and should for oversight activities, but for us to somehow defund the training of chaplains to implement Don't Ask, Don't Tell makes no sense. Again, chaplains will be worried. For instance, Catholic chaplains will be worried to advise their followers that homosexuality is a sin. If that is not included in the training. Those that for whom homosexuality is not a sin will also likewise be worried about advising the troops. There will be a void, a huge void, to not train the spiritual advisors to members of our military about the implementation of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I mean, why not try to not train any of the troops? I mean, there's a whole, again, whether you supported it or not, I think most of us believe that it was better that there was a training process and, let's say, a court had ordered, which has now happened, absent a training process and instantaneous change. With regard to the chaplaincy, to second-guess an internal military training document, again, which they have indicated that they will revise accordingly, is to show a huge lack of judgment of the men and women who run the military, an enormous lack of confidence in the institution of the chaplaincy, an offense to the chaplaincy of the military, to somehow deign that Congress is expressing that they should not be trained regarding a major military policy, that they should somehow take the risk on their own, that they should worry about advising members of their faith with regard to, within their faith tradition, whether homosexuality is a sin or not, regarding members of their faith as to whether they can be married or not. This is a diverse country religiously. And likewise, the institution of our military reflects that diversity. And to somehow, again, second-guess a military training document that hasn't even been read by the prime sponsor of this amendment shows a tremendous lack of faith and is a very dangerous precedence for Congress in terms of interfering with the training procedures of the military. We could, of course, as a body or as individual members, go through every single training manual, find things we like, find things we don't like. But again, to micromanage the military to that extent, particularly in light of a policy change which has ramifications for the chaplaincy. The chaplaincy is, by and large, where the rubber meets the road with regard to how individual members are being advised about their sexual orientation, about what behaviors are moral and what behaviors are immoral. And to somehow say that Congress will tell the chaplaincy not to train anybody on implementing this policy change leaves our soldiers in a spiritual lurch. It leaves our Christian soldiers in a spiritual lurch. It leaves our Jewish soldiers in a spiritual lurch, our Muslim soldiers in a Jewish lurch, all of those who take advantage of the good offices of the chaplaincy in the military, just as, of course, we have a chaplain in this fine institution, the United States Congress. So, again, this is a change that perhaps many members of the chaplaincy were not in favor of. Some were. It depends on their faith position, their own political opinions. But they need to be trained in accordance with military protocols, and this amendment would gut that, and I strongly urge a no vote, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Does anyone seek recognition on this amendment? The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Kansas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kansas rise?
I asked for the ayes and nays. I asked for a recorded vote.
Does the gentleman ask for a recorded vote?
Yes, I do.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Kansas will be postponed. What purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
Madam Chair, I rise to offer an amendment to H.R. 2219.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Tonko of New York. At the end of the bill, before the short title, insert the following section. None of the funds made available by this Act may be used to pay a contractor under a contract with the Department of Defense for costs of any amount paid by the contractor or subcontractor to an employee performing work under the contract for compensation if the compensation of the employee for a fiscal year exceeds the rate payable for Level 1 of the Executive Schedule under Section 5312 of Title V, United States Code, regardless of the contract funding source.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Madam Chairman, I reserve a point of order on the gentleman's amendment.
The point of order is reserved. The gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The highest individual government salary funded by the American taxpayer is that of the President of the United States at a total of $400,000, or so I thought. The President is certainly the highest paid public servant, but it turns out that the leader of the free world isn't actually the highest paid executive on the taxpayer's payroll. In fact, the highest federal government salaries by far can be earned by private sector executives who are paid up to $700,000 per year directly in taxpayer dollars. I do not mean executives who earn their multi-million-dollar incomes by selling often overpriced and underperforming equipment to our men and women in uniform. Though the customer is the federal government, those salaries are paid through transactions in the private sector. No, I am talking about the federal government salaries paid directly by the Pentagon and other agencies to private contractor executives, direct salaries paid for 100% by taxpayer dollars. You won't find these exorbitant pay rates on government income lists. They certainly aren't subject to the current federal employee pay and hiring freeze. In fact, that $700,000 maximum salary increases every year to reach even greater heights, even as we contemplate cutting other areas of our budget to new lows, including that of our military service branches. These salaries are being paid by a department that has not been able to pass a standard audit in its entire history. It cannot even tell us how many contractors are on its payroll. Madam Chair, the salary of a typical Army private starts at a meager $20,000 per year. General Petraeus, a four-star general with 37 years of active service, the commander of the international coalition in Afghanistan, and the next director of the CIA, earns a salary of approximately $180,000. The Secretary of Defense earns about $200,000. How then can we justify salaries of up to $700,000 for defense contractor executives? I understand that there may be contractors who supply services to our nation that our government cannot perform on its own. However, I am also absolutely certain that there is no one single private contractor whose value to our national security is twice that of the Commander-in-Chief of the United States military. At a time when the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs is telling us that the nation's debt is the #1 threat facing America, we cannot continue using taxpayer dollars to pay lavish and unjustifiable private contractor salaries that are more than triple the pay of our military leadership. My amendment simply states that funds in this bill will not be used to pay a federal government salary for any individual defense contractor that exceeds the salary of the Secretary of Defense. That salary is level 1 of the executive schedule, or about $200,000. This is a very modest reform. It is not about limiting contracts or contract spending more broadly. It does not deal with outsourcing or insourcing. It does not, in fact, cap contractor pay, which may include private sector projects, profit sharing, or other earnings. It merely deals with the salary paid to contractors directly by the taxpayer, limiting the cost of that compensation in an effort to reduce the deficit and stop paying exorbitant federal salaries to private sector employees. I think this amendment forms a perfect complement to Section 8050 of the underlying bill, which deals with limiting contractor bonuses. I hope my colleagues will join me in supporting this amendment and other modest, simple reforms that can help us tackle the deficit. With that, I thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Madam Chairman, I make a point of order against the amendment because it proposes to change existing law and constitutes legislation on an appropriations bill, and therefore violates Clause 2 of Rule 21. The rule states in pertinent part, an amendment to a general appropriations bill shall not be in order if changing existing law. The amendment requires a new determination, and I ask for a ruling from the chair.
Does anyone else wish to speak on the point of order? The chair is prepared to rule. The chair finds that this amendment includes language requiring a new determination of the amount of compensation of certain employees. The amendment therefore constitutes legislation in violation of Clause 2 of Rule 21. The point of order is sustained and the amendment is not in order. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington
Madam
rise?
Chairman, I move to strike the last word
The gentleman
for the
is
purpose of a colloquy.
the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I move to strike the last word. I rise for the purpose of engaging in a colloquy with the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Young, our distinguished chairman. I think we agree that it is vitally important to save money in the Joint Strike Fighter program, where it is possible to do so. without negatively impacting performance or schedule. The Joint Program Office and the services which will use the Joint Strike Fighter are to be commended for any efforts to identify potential reductions in program costs. As an example, the Air Force is currently in the process of validating an earlier internal study of ejection seat options for its variant of the aircraft. Would the Chairman agree that if studies like this one make a sound business case that savings will result, then the Air Force's judgment about how its aircraft can be made more cost-effectively equipped could be informed by that conclusion? And I yield to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I agree with him that we should consider all options for cost savings. Should the Air Force present the committee with a study that indicates potential cost savings in the ejection seat without compromising the F-35's performance or schedule, we will certainly look hard at that.
I thank the Chairman and look forward to working with him on this and other matters in our oversight of the Joint Strike Fighter program. And I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado rise?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Polis of Colorado. At the end of the bill, before the short title, insert the following new section. None of the funds made available by this act may be used to maintain an end-strength level of members of the armed forces of the United States assigned to permanent duty in Europe in excess of 30,000 members, and the amounts otherwise provided by this act for military personnel Army, military personnel Navy, military personnel Marine Corps, and military personnel Air Force and Title I of Division A are hereby reduced by $433,966,500, $41,380,000, $6,700,000, and $330,915,000, respectively.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Given the ongoing budget negotiations, we need to explore all options for reducing wasteful spending. And I think we have an easy one in front of us in this amendment. Before we ask the American people to accept painful cuts or accept tax increases, we have an opportunity here to get defense spending under control in a way that does not jeopardize or harm our national security. If we're serious about deficit reduction, we need to do something about the defense budget, and we can do it in a responsible way that doesn't hurt our national security. My amendment would do that by reducing some of the 80,000 troops in Europe where they're no longer needed. We can save hundreds of millions of dollars. So what my amendment would do very simply is reduce the total number of troops stationed in Europe from 80,000 to 30,000, which is more than enough to continue to support our ongoing operations in Libya and Iraq and our responsibilities to NATO for those members who support them. For those who don't, this is not a proxy for those battles. We don't want to cut the troop level so low we can't support those operations. We'll allow the DoD to save money by closing those bases that are no longer needed. By pulling 50,000 troops out of Western Europe and closing bases, we can save money, reduce our redundant military force, and CBO has scored the savings of this amendment as over $800 million. On top of the savings reduced by reducing our troop level, my amendment would allow us to station troops in the U.S. instead of Europe, where it's 10 to 20% less expensive. It would allow the Pentagon to close bases across Europe that, frankly, are relics of World War II and the Cold War. The U.S. taxpayer didn't sign up to indefinitely defend our wealthy Western European allies from a non-existent threat. These bases cost U.S. taxpayers millions upon millions of dollars. On top of that, they're often unpopular with the local people of the countries they're located in. Our European allies are some of the richest countries in the world, so why are we subsidizing their defense spending? Our European allies have enjoyed a free ride on the American dime for too long. Today, our European allies spend an average of about 2% of GDP on defense, while America spends 4 to 5%. That means the average American spends $2,500 on defense, the average European $500 on defense. Now, if Europe feels they are under a military threat, first of all, I'd like to hear from who it's from. It's not clear who's about to attack France or Germany. But if Europe does feel they're under a threat, they can afford to spend more on defense, and we can be confident that we can spend less on defense. We cannot afford to subsidize the defense of France and Germany from an unknown and unidentified threat. This amendment does not signal a weakening in our commitment to NATO. With modern technology, we can move troops and weapons quickly across the globe into theaters of operation. We retain sufficient presence in Europe with 30,000 troops for our joint training responsibilities under NATO. There's simply no need to have nearly 100,000 troops. It's time to rethink our defense spending. We're not under threat by the Nazis. We're not under threat by the Soviets. Terrorism is a real threat. It's an amorphous threat that's not bound by nations or states, and in fact, it does not have its main nexus in Western Europe. Maintaining bases in Europe is simply not a sane or rational response to this threat, nor is it fiscally responsible. Even Donald Rumsfeld thinks it's time for a change of policy. In his recent book, he wrote, quote, "Of the 250,000 troops deployed abroad in 2001, more than 100,000 were in Europe, the vast majority stationed in Germany to fend off an invasion by a Soviet Union that no longer existed," end quote. These cuts proposed in my amendment are part of the recommendations of the Sustainable Defense Task Force, a bipartisan project. The Sustainable Defense Task Force brought together defense experts from across the ideological spectrum and proposed common sense recommendations for saving taxpayer money without jeopardizing our national defense, and that's exactly what this is, common sense. At a time when we must seriously consider cuts to wasteful government spending, we should not continue to subsidize the defense of wealthy European nations against a non-existent Nazi threat, a non-existent Soviet threat. Let's get serious here. We can start by reducing our military presence in Europe, saving the American people hundreds of millions of dollars while protecting our national security interests. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Madam Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
The gentleman from Colorado offered a similar amendment to the 2012 National Defense Authorization Bill earlier this year, and it failed by a vote of 96 to 323. He offered a similar amendment during consideration of H.R. 1 earlier this year, which failed by a vote of 74 to 351. The setting of our military end strength is not something that should be done lightly. In fact, this is the sole jurisdiction of the Committee on the Armed Services. They are responsible for setting military personnel end strengths, and the levels that would be set by this amendment are significantly below those in the House-passed 2012 National Defense Authorization Act. For that and many other reasons, I am opposed to this amendment.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Madam Chair?
The amendment is not agreed to.
On that, I request a roll call vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Connecticut rise?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. At the end of the bill, before the short title, insert the following section. None of the funds made available by this act may be used to purchase non-combat vehicles for use outside of the United States if such vehicles are not substantially manufactured in the United States, as defined in the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Madam Chairman, I reserve a point of order on the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman's point of order is reserved. The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since 2003, the Defense Department reports that it has spent approximately $1.3 billion to buy non-combat vehicles from foreign vehicle manufacturers. Now, you may ask, why is that? We have a law on the books that's called the Buy American Act, and it generally requires that when we are buying items for use by the U.S. military and they are available here in the United States, that they should be bought from U.S. companies. Makes a lot of sense. If we're going to be spending billions of dollars in taxpayer money, we should make sure that it goes to fund U.S. manufacturers and U.S. jobs. But here's the problem. There are a number of loopholes, a growing number of exceptions to the Buy America law. The biggest is this one. One of the exceptions says that if you are buying a particular good for use outside of the United States, you don't have to comply with the Buy America clause at all. Well, that becomes a pretty enormous, truck-sized loophole when we are fighting two wars abroad, because much of what we are purchasing goes immediately to foreign companies. And so you have a situation where non-combat vehicles, light trucks, ambulances, buses, motorcycles, vehicles that are made by a multitude of American manufacturers are now being bought overseas. And our taxpayer dollars are going to foreign, European, and Asian vehicle manufacturers and into the pockets of foreign workers. Now, this is a much bigger problem than just this one category of spending. In fact, the DoD has spent about $36 billion in purchases from foreign companies for use outside of the United States. In fact, just this last year, there were about 38,000 waivers to the Buy America Act for a variety of exceptions. And over the last 4 years, about 161,000 waivers to the Buy America Act. This is a very large problem as we see growing numbers of exceptions to the Act. This one, though, is the biggest. And, well, I think we've got to pass comprehensive legislation to try to take on these growing waivers from the Buy America Act. This amendment, which I offer with my good friend Representative Peters of Michigan, will simply restrict the purchase of these everyday non-combat vehicles to vehicles that are made by American workers. Now, people in my state of Connecticut and around the country were out of work, and a $1.3 billion infusion, money that we're going to spend anyways, will help create jobs. To be successful in the 21st century, we can't continue to cede our manufacturing capacity to overseas workers. The Department of Defense is the world's largest purchaser of many types of products, and we must do all that we can to make sure that we're putting this money, our taxpayers' money, to work here at home, while not doing any damage to the mission abroad. These non-combat vehicles could easily be manufactured by American plants, and it's high time that we put people back to work here in this country. I'd urge adoption of this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Madam Chairman, I make a point of order against the amendment because it proposes to change existing law and constitute legislation in an appropriations bill, and therefore violates Clause 2 of Rule 21. The rule states in pertinent part, an amendment to a general appropriations bill shall not be in order if changing existing law. The amendment requires a new determination, and I ask for a ruling from the chair.
Anyone else seek time to speak on the point of order?
Madam Chair.
The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized.
Madam Chair, just to quickly point out that this is a pretty bread and butter vanilla restriction on funding. As I understand, one of the objections is that this would change the duties of contracting officers who now don't apply the Buy America law. In fact, normal course of training requirements for contracting specialists already educate those specialists in how to apply the Buy America law, whether or not they currently do it today, and I do believe for that reason that the amendment is germane.
Does anyone else wish to speak on the point of order? If not, the chair is prepared to rule. The gentleman from Florida makes a point of order that the amendment offered by the gentleman from Connecticut proposes to change existing law in violation of Clause 2C of Rule 21. As recorded in Deschler's precedents, Volume 8, Chapter 26, Section 52, even though a limitation or an exception therefrom might refrain from explicitly assigning new duties to officers of the government if it implicitly requires them to make investigations, compile evidence, or make judgments and determinations not otherwise required of them by law, then it assumes the character of legislation and is subject to a point of order under Clause 2C of Rule 21. The proponent of a limitation assumes the burden of establishing that any duties imposed by the provision either are merely ministerial or are already required by law. The Chair finds that limitation proposed in the amendment offered by the gentleman from Connecticut does not simply impose a negative restriction on the funds in the bill. Instead, it requires the officials concerned to make a determination regarding whether a certain item to be acquired for use outside the United States is substantially manufactured in the United States, a matter with which they are not charged under existing law. On these premises, the Chair concludes that the amendment offered by the gentleman from Connecticut proposes to change existing law. Accordingly, the point of order is sustained. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Washington rise?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Herrera Butler of Washington. At the end of the bill, before the short title, insert the following. Section, none of the funds made available by this act may be used to enter into a contract that allows the contractor to use amounts paid to the contractor under such contract to pay a tax to the Afghan Ministry of Finance.
The gentlewoman from Washington is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We are in Afghanistan right now, helping to rebuild, or in many cases, build from scratch infrastructure. And what we leave in that country, and I do hope we'll be leaving soon, we will leave that infrastructure behind. Power grids, water systems, trained law enforcement, the building blocks of a functioning society. We'll spend billions of dollars on improvements meant to better the lives of the Afghan people. We don't need to also pay taxes to the Afghan government for the privilege of building or rebuilding their country. And that's why I'm happy to bring this amendment to the floor tonight for consideration. Department of Defense should be focused on providing soldiers in training in the field and on the front lines with the tools they need to protect themselves and defend our country. This amendment would uphold existing law and clarify existing agreements between the U.S. and Afghanistan prohibiting Afghanistan from taxing U.S. contractors doing this rebuilding work in Afghanistan. Now, this ban on levying taxes would also apply to all subcontractors that may not have direct contacts with Afghanistan. In other words, if a company is working on a project funded by the U.S. Department of Defense, whether that company is a prime contractor or a subcontractor, that company should not be subject to taxes from the Afghani government. These are the contractors doing rebuilding work in Afghanistan, helping rebuild the Afghanis' infrastructure and hopefully allowing them to one day thrive independently. Common sense and financial prudence says that the U.S. should not be subject to taxation for the rebuilding efforts it's paying for. Hardworking Americans send their tax dollars to Washington so that soldiers on the front lines have the tools they need to protect themselves and our country, not fill the coffers of foreign governments. So I urge its adoption, and with that, I yield back my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Madam Chairman, I rise to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I would like to say, Madam Chairman, that the gentlelady has worked long and hard to write this amendment in such a way as to be acceptable to the parliamentarian, and I am very happy to accept her amendment and ask for its support.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington rise?
I rise to strike the requisite number of words.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I'm going to read this amendment. None of the funds made available by this act may be used to enter into a contract that allows the contractor to use amounts paid to the contractor under such contract to pay a tax to the Afghan Ministry of Finance. I want to congratulate the the gentlelady from Washington State for being able to work so tirelessly to get this amendment perfected. And it's very clear what her intent is, and we're prepared on our side to accept this amendment.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Washington. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Lewis of Georgia. At the end of the bill, before the short title, insert the following section. The Secretary of Defense shall post on the public website of the Department of Defense the cost to each American taxpayer of each of the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Madam Chairman, I rise to reserve a point of order on the gentleman's amendment.
The point of order is reserved. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, let me begin by thanking the ranking member, Mr. Dix, and his staff for all of their hard work on this legislation. As always, they offer great assistance and guidance for all members and staff, regardless of our differences on policy. Thank you all for all that you do. Madam Chair, my amendment is very simple. It requires that the Department of Defense put on its website the cost of war to each American taxpayer. It is time for Americans to have a receipt for these 10 years of war. What has it cost us? How much cold, hard cash has been spent? I've stood here time and time again and listened to debates about how we don't have any money. There's no money for the elder, no money for the sick, no money for the poor, no money for women, no money for children, no money for people who lost their jobs by no fault of their own. It just costs too much. No money for you or you or you. But when it comes to war in Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Libya, there seems to be a bottomless pit of resources. It is not fair. It is not right. We nickel and dime the people who need it most. But when it comes to war, there's a big, fat, blank check. We need to be honest with ourselves. We need to be honest with each other. Across the country, there are Americans, hard-working, taxpaying citizens who oppose war. They oppose their hard-earned dollars being sent overseas to support 10 long years of war. But let me be clear, Madam Chair. They do not oppose paying their taxes. They're not anarchists or anti-government activists. But as conscientious objectors to war, these Americans want their taxes invested here at home. They want to help provide food for the hungry, safe roads, and strong schools. They want Medicare and Social Security to exist for their parents, their children, and their grandchildren. They want their tax dollar to care for soldiers and their family when they return home. They want to see an end and a cure to cancer. They want a cure for AIDS. They want to see small business thrive and innovation become the engine of our economy. They want high-speed rail that rival Europe and Asia. They want transit systems that are safe and get people where they need to go. They want government to work for them. Even if you do not oppose war, don't you want to know what it costs you and your family? It's time, Madam Chair, it's time for the Department of Defense to be honest with the American people. This is not some wild, crazy, far-fetched idea. It is simple, common sense, transparency, and good governance. This amendment takes a tiny, small step in the right direction. Madam Chair, it is my hope and prayer that all of my colleagues will support this straightforward amendment. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman, for what purposes, gentleman from Florida, rise?
Well, Madam Chairman, I make a point of order against the amendment because it proposes to change existing law and constitutes legislation in an appropriations bill. Therefore, it violates Clause 2 of Rule 21. The rule states in pertinent part, an amendment to a general appropriations bill shall not be in order if changing existing law. The amendment gives affirmative direction in effect, and I ask for a ruling from the chair.
Does anyone else wish to speak on the point of order? Gentleman from Georgia.
I made my point, and I don't have another point to make. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair is prepared to rule on the point of order. The chair finds that this amendment includes language imparting direction. The amendment therefore constitutes legislation in violation of Clause 2 of Rule 21. The point of order is sustained and the amendment is not in order. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Madam Chairman, I move that the committee do now rise.
The question is on the motion that the committee do now rise. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. The committee rises.
Motion to adjourn after.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union, having had under consideration H.R. 2219, directs me to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole reports no resolution on H.R. 2219. The Chair lays before the House the following personal request.
Leaves of absence requested for Mr. Culberson of Texas for Wednesday, July 6th, and for the balance of the week, and Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas for today after 6 p.m. and Friday, July 8th.
Without objection, the requests are granted.
Mr. Speaker, I make a motion that the House do now adjourn.
The question is now on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow.
So the House is gavelled out, but earlier today, members continued work on 2012 Defense Department spending. Debate and votes on amendments took place, and we expect to see more of that tomorrow. The legislation provides $649 billion